My name is Joseph Wong. The last time I convened, or I had the privilege of convening a Taiwan Studies event, I had a different title. I was the director of the Asian Institute at the time. The last time there was an election in Taiwan, I was the director of the Asian Institute. I no longer am the director of the Asian Institute, having faithfully and happily served in that role for 9 years, although I continue to be here at the Monk School. I'm the Ralph and Roz Howard Professor of Innovation and also a Professor and Candidate Research Chair in the Department of Political Science. This is fantastic to see so many people out for this Taiwan event. I'm sure it's not just simply a partisan support or a show of partisan support in terms of what's happened in Taiwan's elections, but rather the continued interest that our friends of the university, our students inside the university, and indeed the Asian Institute here at the Monk School of Global Affairs, our friendship and our interest with and in Taiwan. We here at the Asian Institute have been very fortunate over the last few years. We were the beneficiary of a grant to run the Global Taiwan Studies program, and this was a fantastic way. In fact, there are several students in this room who took that Global Taiwan Studies seminar, have since graduated, now I'm very happy to know are employed, and have come back to come and continue to engage in conversations that we have here about Taiwan and Taiwan studies. It also, I think, speaks to the importance of Taiwan. The Asian Institute, as you can imagine, is pushed and pulled by various pressures and interests around the world, and certainly in Asia. And it's fantastic that Taiwan, which is not a particularly, I think Shelley's last book was global, small island global powerhouse. We had a long debate about this in Taiwan. Small place, but continues to occupy a massive stage in the international arena. So this is really something that I'm grateful for all of you for being here and participating in what will no doubt be a very fruitful conversation. Actually, all three of us were in Taiwan for the elections. Of course, Professor Wong is a professor at Danjiang University, and Shelley and I were as part of a delegation by the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, and so we had an opportunity to really get an insider view of what went on, and I know that all three of us look forward to sharing some of our thoughts and insights about those elections. But before we do, I'd like to welcome and introduce to you the new Director General from the Taipei Economic Cultural Office here in Toronto, the former Director General Ambassador who has now been moved to Ottawa. He is now Taiwan's representative to Canada, so it's a fantastic promotion for him. But in his stead, we have Ms. Catherine Xu, who is a seasoned Foreign Service officer with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She has served in the United States. She has been the Deputy Director General for International Organizations at the MOFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Taipei. She received both her undergraduate and graduate degrees from Zhengzhou University in Taipei. So this is the first time we've had an opportunity to meet, and I'm glad it's in this environment and it's about this topic. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce and welcome Director General Xu to make a few words of welcome. Thank you. The conversations will ensue. I should also add, I've had the good fortune of being on various observation delegations since 2000. And I don't know if I was telling Shelley, but every time I leave Taiwan, I always feel a sense of anxiety after one of these things. Too many questions unanswered. Too many things that I need to follow up. But one of the things that I left, a feeling that I left with this time, and again, I'm not sure if I told Shelley, but is that I felt calm, and I felt like, as I was just recently wrote with a co-author of mine, that Taiwan was a normal democracy. And as one of the reviewers pointed out, this was the greatest compliment one could play a place like Taiwan, to call it a normal democracy. So where it is a little still very Taiwanese in flavor is that even when it's an electoral landslide, it continues to be very cute in its graphics. And so these were screenshots that I took on the night of the elections. The left-hand side, these were from the China Times website off my phone, and I just transferred them over to the slide. So these numbers for the presidential election results were incomplete at the time. This was actually still quite early on. Tsai Ing-wen eventually wins the presidency with 56.1%. Eric Zhu takes 31%. James Song takes 12.8%. So just to give you again some sense of the presidential election results. And then on the right are the results for the legislative yuan. In the numbers, the black numbers on the left-hand column are the number of seats that were won in this election, and the number in black on the right-hand column were the number of seats that the party had held. And so we can see here the Kuomintang goes from 64 seats to 35, down 29. The DPP wins 68 seats, and the legislature is comprised of 113 seats, so it has a majority. The DPP wins 68 seats, which is an increase of 28 seats. The Qingmingdang, the PFP, wins 3 seats. All of them were in the proportional representation seats, so non-district seats. The PFP did not win an electoral district, but instead it took 6.5% of the popular vote, which entitles it then to a proportional representation in the number of seats it takes 3. Where it says Jihad, the other, actually is the new power party. I guess the graphics hadn't quite caught up to, although it's unbelievable that it hadn't at this point, had caught up to this. The new power party took 5 seats, 3 of them in districts, 2 of them were PR seats with 6.1% of the vote. And the Taiwan Solidarity Union loses all 3 of the seats that it held in 2012. So what we have as a bottom line is we have a DPP president and we have a DPP majority in the legislature. When looked at from the point of view of the KMT, this is also the first time that the KMT has lost both the presidency, and the Pan-Blue camp, which the KMT is the leader of, has also lost the legislature. And that would make this an unprecedented election result. So we're going to have, we have extraordinarily able commentators to offer their insights on the elections. They'll speak for between 15 and 20 minutes. Let me introduce first Professor Alexander Wong. He's the professor at the Institute of Strategic Studies in Danjiang University. He's also the founder and the chair of on the Council on Strategic and Wargaming Studies, which is based in Taipei. I just saw from your business card. He has also served as Deputy Minister of the Mainland Affairs Council in the government of Taiwan. He studied both of his graduate degrees, an MA degree from Georgetown and his PhD from George Washington University. Following him will be Professor Shelley Rigger. She is the Brown Professor of East Asian Politics and the Chair of Chinese Studies, as well as recently the Assistant Dean for Educational Policy at Davidson College. She has a PhD in government from Harvard. She did her undergraduate at Princeton. She has written numerous books. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'll just tell you the first one and the last one, and there's a whole slew in between. The first one, which remains a classic, is Politics in Taiwan, Voting for Democracy, published by Routledge, and most recently, Why Taiwan Matters, Small Island, Global Powerhouse. And she has the distinct honor of being one of the very few of us foreigners whose books are actually sold at Eslit Bookstore, Chenping Bookstore. All of us hope one day that betting on biotech or something like that will actually be sold in Chenping, but we know, of course, that's wishful thinking. So 15 to 20 minutes each. The elections, I wrote a very short piece for the Asia Pacific Foundation in which the subtitle was Certain Outcome, Uncertain Implications. I was fairly confident about that. We all had a sense as to what the election results were going to be like, but what that meant in terms of Taiwan's domestic politics, its economics, and indeed its cross-strait relations, I think. Certainly the week before the elections were very uncertain in most people's minds. It probably still is a little bit uncertain in most people's minds now, but having experienced the election and having had a chance to reflect on it, I think now we get a little bit of a clearer sense or at least we now know the proper questions to ask. So the reflections I want to give is, rather than a post-mortem on why we see the election results that we see, I want to project ahead and speculate a little bit about what I refer to as being the uncertain implications of an election for which we knew the outcome really prior to even going to Taiwan. The first speculative line of thinking is the future of the KMT. In 2008, Edward Friedman and I put together a book called Learning to Lose. And this book was really motivated by watching the reaction of the KMT upon losing the presidential elections in 2000 and 2004, of course bearing in mind that it always controlled the legislature. But what we were trying to identify there was a dynamic, particularly in dominant party systems such as the Taiwanese system in which the Kuomintang had ruled for so long, this dynamic of losing, and what comes with losing, and what kinds of adaptations come with losing to strengthen democracy in the end. In my mind, and this is not meant to be a partisan statement, the KMT lost, but in my mind it could not lose badly enough. Because I think in many ways, what the KMT needed in order for it to survive into the future was for it to lose badly. And for it to really understand some of the analysis, for instance, or the diagnosis that Shelley has provided. To understand that the old way of doing things, the old way in which it could capture issue areas and cleavage space and whatnot, was beginning to fall apart, that the linkage between the party leadership and the grassroots was becoming distant, and so on. In other words, it couldn't lose badly enough because it had to learn how to lose. And indeed, prior to the election, and we met with some KMT officials, there were still some KMT officials who were saying, look, you know, we're going to lose, but really the best strategy is we'll just let the DPP fail, and then, you know, everyone will come to their senses and vote us in again. That's not learning from losing, right? That's not the lesson that you want the KMT to learn. In this respect, and I think what this election does is that it really, unlike 2000 and 2004, provides a serious wake-up call to a party that, frankly, from its own sense of power and its own sense of its rightful place as the presumed governing party of Taiwan, it's a party at death's door. And when I talk to friends in the KMT, I say to them, you know, there is also another presumptive ruling party that found itself at death's door, and it now is the government of Canada. So these parties can rebound, these parties can rebuild, these parties can rebound so long as they understand that they have lost. And I don't think that's something that comes easily to former dominant and certainly incumbent parties. The second reaction is with respect to the economy. The economy, and I'm a political economist, so I think about this stuff all the time, the economy has experienced extraordinary sluggishness, but what I want to stress, and indeed as I stress to my friends in Taiwan, the challenges that Taiwan's economy faces today are not easy to fix. We heard a lot of policy rhetoric. We've got to become an innovation-driven economy. We have to think about redistribution. We have to think about increasing our value add. We have to think about how we can break the chain of jobless growth and so on. This point I want to stress here is that the economy in Taiwan is, for all intents and purposes, a mature industrial economy. The challenges that it is facing, for instance, consumption-driven inequality. If you look right now in terms of housing prices in Taipei, this is consumption-driven inequality that is symptomatic of all mature post-industrial economies that are frankly rich. This is an economy that is experiencing jobless growth. Well, the fact of the matter is that among OECD countries, 50% of all new jobs created since the 1990s have been informal jobs and don't count in the formal sector. All industrial economies and post-industrial economies are experiencing jobless growth. In this respect, and I think the challenge for the DPP in terms of its management of the economy and trying to quell some of the anxieties that Alexander and Shelley have raised, is really more about managing expectations. It's about changing the terms of the debate from a sort of retrospective look on Taiwan's high growth go-go period of the 70s and 80s when 10% growth and a 0.3 Gini coefficient was the norm. Those days are gone, right? 4% growth would be astronomical. If you could reduce the unemployment rate down to 5%, that would be phenomenal. in this day and age. So I think what's absolutely critical for the DPP as it moves forward, as it continues to spew, as all governments do, policy rhetoric, is managing expectations. And I think that's going to require some real political crafting on the part of the DPP government. The third reflection is with respect to Tsai Ing-wen as a moderate. One of the interesting things on election night, I mean, on previous election nights, when the presidential election results are announced, the president goes out and the rally is held. And there's this huge party. And I don't know, maybe sometimes presidents say things that they might not want to say at these kinds of rallies or whatever. But what was the interesting thing about Tsai Ing-wen was that she held her press conference immediately after the election results were held, before she went out to the rally. And she kept all of her supporters waiting, and they were getting really quite antsy, but she had her international press conference, where again, for most of us who were watching this was really an exercise in assuring Beijing and assuring Washington. And the questions that were posed to her, both in Chinese and English, were very difficult questions. They were asking her to parse very, very fine language. They were asking to walk a very fine line, which she was willing and able to do in this press conference setting, and not having gone out and spoken to the masses after the presidential rally. So the question then is Tsai a moderate? And there's two ways of asking this question. One is, does Tsai really occupy a moderate position? Or is Tsai pursuing a strategy of moderation? And this is an empirical question. I mean, only time will tell in terms of what her true intentions are, in terms of how she wants to move this forward. If, in fact, she wants to occupy a moderate position, there is a deep green constituency within the Pan-Greens that will want her to answer to that, will want to know or want to have some sort of explanation. If she is pursuing a strategy of moderation, that is to say, this is a rhetoric of moderation in order to quell the anxieties of Beijing and Washington, then there is a light green that will eventually be alienated by this tactic. This is a big challenge for Tsai. And again, when posed as a question of whether or not this is a strategy of moderation or a moderate position, I think provides the right questions we ought to be asking as we begin to look forward to the Tsai presidency. The last point I want to make, and it's reflective of the title of this panel, is that I want to make the argument that we are in a new normal in Taiwan. And not just a new normal because we've seen the complete transfer of power in both the presidency and the legislature, but really a new normal in terms of how Taiwan views its own politics and how Taiwan views itself vis-a-vis cross-strait relations. To get at this, I want to actually ask the question, what does the political landscape look like from China's point of view? You know, if we really want to get a sense as to whether or not Taiwan has entered a new normal, one way of thinking about it is, well, how does China see what's happened in Taiwan? And to get at this, and this is something that I had been thinking about for a long while, actually dating back to conversations I had with friends in Beijing and in China more generally, is the counterfactual question. And just bear with me for a moment. If the counterfactual question is this: what would have happened if Tsai had won in 2012? I mean, we know, of course, she didn't. It was a landslide, it was a campaign. But what would have happened if Tsai had won in 2012? Well, for one, Beijing would have had to respond, because Beijing is programmed to respond. I mean, it has to respond in terms of fulfilling its own foreign policy objectives. But in talking to people in China, what's interesting is, and I've asked them, you know, shortly after the election, shortly before the 2012 election, I said, what if Tsai Ing-wen wins? The vast majority of the people I've spoken to, this is unscientific, but these are people who are, you know, informing and have the ear of policymakers inside China, that they conceded that they could work with Tsai, that they viewed her as a moderate, but most importantly, they viewed her as not Chen Shui-bian. She was the anti-Chen Shui-bian. And again, if you go back to 2012, this was a particularly heightened moment for Chen as he was embroiled in his own personal scandals and so on. This was the DPP that was reeling. She was the anti-Chen Shui-bian. She was distancing herself from Chen Shui-bian. And I think from the point of view, from China's vantage point anyway, they could work with Tsai. And in fact, they could hem Tsai in a way that would create a new normal for them in terms of how they would manage cross-strait relations. Had Taiwan in 2012, again asking the counterfactual, had she won in 2012, we would have prevented, or at least from China's point of view, prevented the real political awakening of the younger generation in Taiwan. A real political awakening of this younger generation in Taiwan that manifests itself in the Sunflower Movement, but also manifests itself in a new discourse on nationalism, what it means to be Taiwanese. And this comes to a head, of course, in the Sunflower Movement, but for many, including, older people like myself, thought, okay, the Sunflower Movement is this is the anomaly, it's gonna, everything's gonna go back to normal, but it actually carries through to the elections, through the formation of new political parties and through the voter turnout that we see among younger voters, and so on. And third, had Taiwan in 2012, China could have avoided the sad state that the KMT is in now. In many ways, by the KMT having lost so badly, China has in many ways lost an important ally, a reliable ally on Taiwan. But the fact of the matter is, this is a counterfactual question. Tsai did not win. The question then is that by her not winning, are we now in fact in a new normal? And this, of course, is an empirical question. We can't generate it from a counterfactual. This is something that we actually have to think about moving forward. But does the election of Tsai, by not having won in 2012, but the election of Tsai in 2016, does it reflect fundamental change such that we're in a new normal? Or is it simply anomalous? Another way of putting this question is, was the Sunflower Movement a fundamental political awakening, or was it simply epiphenomenal, given that what was going on in Taiwan at the time? I want to argue that Taiwan, in fact, is in a new normal, that what we are seeing is a fundamental change, that the Sunflower Movement was not simply epiphenomenal. It itself as a movement may have been epiphenomenal, but the consequences of it are not. And this has fundamentally changed the nature of cross-strait relations. And I say this to be provocative. What do I mean by the new normal? Well, one is we see a fundamental rejection on the part of the voter of the 1992 consensus. This doesn't mean that Tsai, or this doesn't mean that the president of Taiwan will fundamentally and unequivocally reject the 1992 consensus. But the sentiment of the voter is such that we see the rejection of the 1992 consensus. Polling shows not only do we see a rejection of the 92 consensus, but we also see increasing skepticism about the ROC framework. And the ROC framework is the basis upon which Tsai now wants to proceed in terms of her dialogue and managing relations with Beijing, which makes prudent, moderate sense. But that doesn't mean that the electorate, the voters that voted her in, are that enamored with the ROC Constitution as the framework for meaningful dialogue across the Taiwan Strait. And third, and I do not say this in any partisan way, I'm just simply reflecting, I think, what the voters are saying to those in Taiwan, that the majority of voters in Taiwan understand Taiwan simply to be independent. Not de jure independent. It obviously is not de jure independent, but I'm left with a sense that this is a Taiwan that feels itself to be de facto independent more than I've ever seen it before. Now, I want to say this because what I want to stress is that it means then that the old categories by which Taiwan and China manage cross-strait relations, the old categories were independence and unification. That these old categories are less and less relevant. Now, there are some, and my good friend John Chia will say that identity politics continues to be the main cleavage, and he's absolutely right in the sense that it continues to be a principal cleavage, but the categories by which these cleavages are captured, independence, which is not going to happen, unification, which is clearly not going to happen, are the categories that no longer structure politics. There was a time when you looked at this distribution, it was basically bimodal. But what we see now in Taiwan increasingly actually is a normal distribution. And unless we want to be fixated on the tails of this normal distribution, the real action is somewhere in between. The question is, what is that in between? I mean, for instance, as we were told, 7% of voters today are not going to be voting in the next election. 1.3 million new voters voted for the first time in this election. Upwards, depending on what polls you're going to believe, upwards of 9 of 10 of them put their lot with the Greens. Right, so something is happening here. We're not just talking about the margins, and what was once a bimodal distribution on, frankly, what were old categories are now a normal distribution in which we are now in a new normal. So the categories have changed. I want to suggest that the game is changing, but to what? Right? And again, looking forward, this is again an empirical question. I do want to stress, however, that this question is not just simply an abstract question. I'm an academic. I could totally live in the world of abstraction forever and be totally fine. But there are some very practical ways in which this game can be reconstituted, of course, which is going to require the say of Beijing, and of course require the say of Washington, and probably disproportionately so, but there is still some political agency left to Taiwan as it tries to define what this new normal is. These are very practical things. So for instance, ideas, a new language. If the old categories of independence and unification are no longer relevant except for on the tails of a normal distribution, what is the new language? How do you define this? What is the new narrative that is potentially possible at this time? There are very practical things the government can do with respect to policies. Economic policies, social policies, labor market policies, tax policies, fiscal policies. If there's any way in which a state can pronounce its existence, it's through taxes. Environmental policy. These are practical ways in which Taiwan can reconstitute its relationship and therefore the game across the strait. And most importantly, in terms of politics. As I suggested at the very beginning of my comments, the new normal in Taiwan is that Taiwan is no longer a unique or abnormal or emerging or young democracy. It's a normal democracy. And there are two ways in which a democracy can fulfill de facto independence. You can either draw borders, which makes those from the outside impervious to affecting your insides, or you can build your autonomy by thickening outwards. And the best way to thicken outwards in terms of Taiwan's new normal is to continue to stoke the democratic politics. This is not about a particular party, but it's about continuing to normalize Taiwan's democracy. So I think there is some scope for agency here in terms of ideas, language, policies, and indeed politics that constitutes a new normal in Taiwan. And it's a Taiwan, I think, that has spoken to all of us who are observing it, that this new normal in Taiwan is a de facto independent Taiwan. That debate, as far as I'm concerned, is over.